sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, good morning. I'm going to do introductions from up here and then sit down and join our panelists. They have such great bios. You absolutely need to read their bios, but I'm going to just do a quick overview of their backgrounds. And the reason why I want to do that is this is a panel about the successes that we've had globally because of collaboration, and their bios have a kind of a key element. So I'm just going to give you the highlights from the bios, and then you can read more about them on the RSA website. So first we're going to start with James Baker. James is the first Assistant Director General for Cyber Threat Intelligence within the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, the ACSC. And that is of the Australian Signals Directorate, ASD. Just want to make sure everybody, since we've got government people here, you must have an alphabet soup of acronyms. So just want to make sure everybody's got them. Okay. Because it wouldn't be a government panel without them. The ASD defends Australia from global threats and advances the national interests by providing foreign signals intelligence, cybersecurity, and offensive cyber operations as directed by the Australian government. ASD works closely with the Australian national security community, overseas intelligence, and cybersecurity partners, academia, and industry. Next, we have Major General Lorna Moloch. And we are both of the Marine Corps family, so Semper Fi. Thank you for being here today. Ura. So Major General Lorna Moloch serves as Commander, Cyber National Mission Force, so that is the CNMF. The CNMF is the U.S. military's joint cyber force charged with defending the nation in cyberspace through full spectrum operations to deter, disrupt if necessary, defeat the adversary cyber and malign influence actors. CNMF supports U.S. Cyber Command and national priorities such as election security, ransomware, cyber espionage, and other crises while remaining persistently engaged globally and supporting contingency operations. We also have Matthias van Amselfort, who is the superintendent at the department head of the Dutch National High-Tech Crime Unit. His team is responsible for investigating activities related to cybercrime, including hacking, ransomware, botnets, DDoS, criminal encrypted communications, cyber-enabled crime, and digital foreign interference. And then we have Brett Leatherman. Brett is the FBI's Deputy Assistant Director for Cyber Operations and serves as Director of the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force. The FBI is the lead federal agency for investigating cyber attacks on U.S. interests, and its strategy is to impose cost on criminal and state cyber adversaries alike, while also providing support to victims. The FBI leverages its unique mix of authorities, capabilities, and partnerships to deter and disrupt malicious actors who conduct cyber operations in support of financial theft and extortion, intelligence gathering, malign foreign influence, destructive attacks, and the theft of intellectual property. Okay, so with that, now that you know their backgrounds and how these groups interrelate, I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. So we'll start with Brett and Lorna. We'll start with you first, if you don't mind. But everybody feel free to jump in here. Each of you represent kind of law enforcement, intelligence agencies, military, with significant responsibility for combating cyber threats. We know that adversaries are developing. Is my mic off? I killed my mic already. It's my magnetic personality. Just saying. Okay, just kidding, everybody.
Might be the Russians.
Okay. Yeah. Nothing like being the moderator and killing your mic already. All right. So first question. So we know that adversaries are developing new techniques to obfuscate their activities. Do you mind talking about recent trends your agencies have seen and the ways you're actually collaborating and working together against the threat?
Okay. All right. I'll start. Really excited to be on the panel, and really thanks to the RSA team for putting this together. from our perspective at the Cyber National Mission Force, you articulated our global remit. And so what we're seeing from an adversary perspective, we've killed the conversation about Bolt Typhoon, but we see China is really emboldened, right? They're using living off the land techniques to be able to get into our critical infrastructure. We're also seeing from a Russia perspective, from a nation state, their activities in Ukraine, they're learning from their activities in Ukraine, right? And so what they're doing is they're taking what they know from a threat intelligence perspective, but also their access to the Ukrainian networks, and they're turning that into warfighting advantage. From a malicious cyber actor perspective, we're also seeing, those actors that come out of the Russia ecosystem, they're also using, zero-day malware, a lot of the things that, the perennial things that we see coming from these malicious cyber actors to be able to attack U.S. Critical infrastructure, conduct ransomware attacks, et cetera. We're also the usual suspects as you go around the globe, from Iran and North Korea, again, using some of the things, the 0 days, the critical vulnerabilities that we have to be able to exploit our networks. How we're going about that, I think that's the conversation we're in today. It's really about the opportunity space. It's how do we operate from an abundance theory perspective. It's, how do we work together collaboratively as partners to be able to operate at the speed of trust? And so you'll hear some exemplars from us today about some of the work that we've done collaboratively across not only the US government, but with our allies and partners to be able to operate and scale against these actors. And that is predicated on, how we operate with industry, how we build those trust constructs. So when we call, whether it's our FBI colleagues or interagency colleagues, or frankly our allies from a UK, from the Australians, whether it's the Five Eye partners and our Dutch partners, are very capable, I might add. We operate at the speed of trust.
Yeah, similar to the general, I would say like last year, the FBI and our IC and our international partners disrupted the Russian FSB's most sophisticated cyber espionage tool, known in open source as Snake, through Operation Medusa. That particular implant was developed by the Russian FSB for 20 years. Highly sophisticated tool, probably millions of dollars in development over time put into that tool by the Russians. We conducted an operation last year that eradicated it from the virtual battlefield. And what I would say is that had a significant impact on the Russians' ability to launch cyber espionage campaigns against the US and our allies. But in today's environment, when you look at Volt Typhoon, when you look at Operation Dying Ember that happened this year as well, which was in a technical operation with our partners to eradicate the Russian GRU's attacks on US and European systems, Operation Medusa is no longer like the flagship operation to eradicate malware when you have these actors using very low-level, not very sophisticated techniques to exploit critical infrastructure, private sector networks, and even government agencies. And so we've seen a shift towards these actors really exploiting CVEs or vulnerabilities that were disclosed years ago, and they're just going unpatched. And so our defensive posture is low enough right now that the actors do not have to use their most sophisticated tools to target us, which requires us here on the stage to work amongst our agencies to both deter through offense and identify ways to deter through defense. And deterrence through defense involves private sector increasing resilience to make it more difficult on the adversary. And so it's not just a government to government agency partnership. It's not just a international partnership. It's a public, private, and international partnership that will raise the cost of doing business to the actors.
James and Matthias, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I might just jump in and I guess piggyback off the statements of Lorna and Brett there, and focusing on two particular trends that we're seeing that are particularly concerning. I guess for me, we have seen a deliberate targeting of what we define as edge devices. So With COVID, a lot of our organisations in Australia and globally went from having a low percentage of remote workforce and sort of remote working to, in some cases, our entire workforce working from home. So to enable that, we rolled out a whole lot of infrastructure and equipment to make sure that that was secure. But by doing so, we enabled the adversaries to have an area to focus in on to potentially exploit to gain a foothold into our network. So what we've seen over the last sort of 6 to 12 months is significant critical vulnerabilities in edge devices, causing, I guess, a lot of the initial exploitation vectors and that first sort of entry point to networks. We're seeing adversaries, as those critical vulnerabilities come out, weaponizing that at a faster rate than ever. So they're taking that opportunity that we kind of created by creating this remote workforce and using that as the entry point and vector. The second point I'd probably highlight is that we are also seeing adversaries, be they nation state or cyber criminals, targeting a lot of the home infrastructure that we have, our routers at home, our routers in our small businesses, which are shipped with default passwords or that are sort of end of life and just sitting there and never being patched, coming back to sort of that low threshold of cyber maturity. We're seeing malicious actors compromise these and use this as their last mile or their last hop into exploiting networks. So for example, in Australia, that means they're coming from genuine Australian IP addresses and home users, not from sort of bulletproof hosters or VPS infrastructure that we can track sort of more traditionally. And so from a network defender's perspective, you sort of can't do that geofencing. You're actually sort of struggling to detect that. So we're working really closely with industry to sort of help shape that tradecraft and find ways to mitigate that. And you'll hear a little bit more about how we're collectively working together to impose cost and move the needle on some of that tradecraft. MJ?
Yeah, I think I can add to that what we see that they use code signing now with legit certificates. So that makes it harder, of course, to detect and easier for them to install the malware. So that's something that we see, and of course, the use of info stealers. So a lot of information got stolen where they can use for ransomware attacks, spear phishing. I think Genesis Market was a great example in what they actually got on information to use for their tool. So I think that's together with AI, of course, that makes it really powerful and hard for us to detect. But that's what we see now, what's being used.
Terrific, and hopefully people are thinking about questions you might want to ask. So the next question here is, it's clear that your organization must leverage your respective authorities in new ways, right, as the technology is evolving, to detect the malicious cyber activities. Can you share ways that your organizations are working together to impose cost? Sort of those deterrence methods, how do you make it more expensive for them? So talk a little bit about how you're imposing costs on the adversaries. And James and MJ, I'll start with you first since you went last.
Okay, thank you very much. I think everybody is familiar with the splash pages that we put on after a takedown, and they see all the flags of the countries that have been involved and the partners, the agencies. Of course, there's a lot of cooperation beforehand, before we are in that, the takedown. There are a lot of joint efforts before that, and it can be bilateral, so with the FBI and our unit, but also it can be bigger operations that are coordinated at Interpol or Europol. And of course, with the takedown, it's really hard for them to rebuild in a short while, so they have to make a lot of costs to do that. And also on the trust of the ransomware group, so they are, of course, that's something that's also part of the strategy. And of course, after the takedown, we start our investigation, so we see a lot of data that we have to analyze, and then the prosecutors start their prosecution on suspects if we can make some arrests. And sometimes, of course, we also have data or subjects living in countries that we don't often work with, and then we have to harmonize the legal options that we have to do and to deal with that. So we have to align that also. I think if we work together with the private sector and sharing the information about trends, we do that also. In the Netherlands, we have a project called Melissa, where we work together with the National Cybersecurity Center and the Prosecutor's Office, and also the large cybersecurity companies in the Netherlands. Yeah, also Trellix is one of the partners, and then we can talk about the new ways that they attack in ransomware in the Netherlands, and then we can do these kinds of investigations and do some proposals for new investigations. So some of them are also here of the partners, so I think everybody should visit the Netherlands pavilion here at the RSA and talk to them. It might be very interesting.
Thanks, MJ. I guess from an Australian perspective, we take a very much a holistic approach to imposing cost on our adversaries. So it is looking at exactly as you say, looking at creative ways to leverage our authorities, our capabilities, and our partnerships to impose that cost. In ASD, we, you mentioned earlier, we have our foreign signals intelligence capability as well. So we leverage that to drive both our offensive and defensive cyber operations, but also to inform our industry partnerships and what we can do with industry to sort of tackle this problem. We also have Operation Aquila, which is a standing joint task force with our federal police that is housed within the ACSC. So that is dedicated resources from both ASD and Australian Federal Police that come together and again look at how we can holistically disrupt and impose cost on cyber criminals that are causing the most damage to the Australian economy and to the Australian people. What are we actually doing, and what does when I say full spectrum, what does that look like? At the pointy end, we have, as I said, offensive cyber capabilities. That's sort of the scalpel approach that we can take. That's very deliberate targeting to impose very specific sort of covert cost on the individuals. Through to sort of working with industry and working with our partners globally to release alerts and advisories to shape the tradecraft and impose cost on the adversaries to make sure that, if they are looking to exploit these critical vulnerabilities, that we are collectively having a big push to shut that down and make that harder for them and make it less valuable. Through to sort of the law enforcement activities that MJ was just talking about, your traditional takedown, disruption, and arrest. And finally, earlier this year, Australia undertook its first use of cyber sanctions to impose a sanction on a Russian cyber criminal, which I'll probably get into a bit more detail later, but that was an exciting move.
I love hearing sanctions. And so MJ advertised that they've got a booth in the pavilion. Do you have one too? That people should visit?
We have Australia House. We have a big offsite that people can come along
okay.
to, but
all right.
feel free to come have a chat afterwards.
Lorna.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what my colleagues highlighted, it's just this opportunity space that we've really embraced. As we think about it from a DoD Cybercom perspective, we think about this in terms of how we campaign against these cyber actors, right? Which is not just one action, but it's this integrated, stitched together, his authorities, our authorities, to be able to deliver outsized outcomes. I'll give you an exemplar of how we create this virtuous cycle with the work we do with these defend forward operations, which is really so critical, where we work at the request of partners and allies to come into their country to be able to find malicious cyber activity on their network. What we find there, we bring back to be able to defend not only the United States, but also our partners and allies. How we do that is with, you heard Morgan Adamski talk earlier about the authorities that NSA has in the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. On the Cybercom side, CNMF has similar authorities. We have an organization called Under Advisement. And so what we know, what we find in foreign space, we take that back. We collaborate with our industry partners in sharing agreements where we share with them what we found. I mean, we can give you a couple of exemplars where we work with our FBI colleagues on Hafnium, right? That was really a really good use case of where we saw, Soho routers being Soho routers being exploited, and we worked together to be able to get after that. And so again, it's not just one thing. It's how do we do sanctions? It's how do we do law enforcement action? But from a military perspective, our job is to go out, right? Really find the adversary where they are, and then we've got the full spectrum of options available to the nation. And then again, that's more impactful where we do synchronized activities against these time and time again. And so, if you're familiar with game theory of warfare, that's the game that we're in right now. This is a perennial problem that will not go away. And I think we've got to gird our loins to be able to be ready to do this again and again. And so if you've read the book, The Infinite Game, it's about, playing to play, to continue to play against these nation state actors, and sometimes it's about playing to win. And so that's how we think about it, as this enduring battle, that enduring activity that we all have battle space in.
Brett?
Well, how do we do it? We pay lots of tolls between Fort Meade and Washington, D.C., so that we are engaged in person, and we earn lots of frequent flyer miles when we go to Europe and back. It is a lot of work to engage partners, but it's meaningful work. And how do you increase cost to the adversary? In the cyber ecosystem, we look at 5 primary pillars in that area. Who are the actors? What is their technical infrastructure? What are their technical tools that they're using? How are they communicating? And then ultimately, what malware and tool sets are they using to target companies or organizations? And the more of those that we can take out in any joint operation, the more impactful that will be to the actors. So if you take out one, you're going to have some disruptive activity, some opportunity to give private sector victims or critical infrastructure some level of reprieve from those attacks. If you take out 2, 3, or 4, or maybe all 5, then that is going to be a much more enduring disruptive operation. And so the FBI can't do that alone. CNMF can't do that alone often and have that enduring impact, and our partners, international partners, can't. But that is why you see those joint sealed documents when we disclose those operations to the public or when we seize infrastructure, and you see so many seals there. I think I talked about Medusa, we had 12 seals on that one joint cybersecurity advisory, which demonstrates the enduring impact of removing that piece of malware from the battlefield, because we targeted all 5 pillars, because we did it using military, law enforcement, and intelligence community authorities in a way that was synchronized and joint and conducted the operation that had maximum impact on the adversary. That is how you impose increased cost during times of war and times of peace in the cyber domain.
Yeah, I love how you said there's the play to play, and then there's the play to win, type of concept, and then imposing costs. So I love all the contributions each of the 4 of you had on that last question. So going into the next question, I'm going to start with you, Lorna, on this one. And this kind of dovetails off of the conversation we had in the last 2 questions, which is the common thread. That's really sort of that thread that has gone through sort of the last set of answers that you've provided on collaboration. And hopefully people are incredibly encouraged to hear about the wins on the board for the good guys. So we've got this government-to-government collaboration going on. Do you mind talking a little bit more about the critical role that the private sector plays and can play in cyber investigations and operations?
Yeah, so I alluded to that a little bit earlier, where we, what we find malicious cyber actors doing abroad, and we bring that back, and the work that we do with our, critical partner. Let me just back up a little bit, because Brett said something that I think it's really important to underscore. As we think about teaming from a cyber national mission force, we've got joint task force aligned against each of the national defense strategy threat. But on those task force, our partners, like at Fort Meade, from the FBI, our allies, our colleagues from Australia, the UK, and others, right? We collaborate. Again, we've got frequent flyer miles with the Dutch, and we've got embeds, right? Like we've got Lieutenant Anik, who's here with me, is my EA. She spent last year with the Dutch, and we've got folks there still. And so, but not only that, we also have a really, really strong relationship with our colleagues, not only in the defense industrial base, but our commercial partners. And so when I think about our joint task force, it's not just the folks on stage in industry, in government and allies. It's the industry, the defense industrial base, our colleagues there that, understand the tools and the technologies, and are in these sharing relationships with, whether it's on the NSA side or on our side from under advisement, to be able to share unique TTPs. It's also, both industry and academia, as you think about, novel technologies that we're not aware of, you bring that to us, and that's what we're seeing. The other piece is, I'm also seeing that there is no dearth of, people who want to help us. There's a ton of people who want to help. And so every organization, every industry event that I've been to, there's always this desire from industry to work with us. And I think, when we talk about, the adversary, I would offer that we've got something that the adversary doesn't. And it's the power of our partnerships. And just know, we've talked about Volt Typhoon yesterday a lot. And I would offer that that adversary is not 10 foot tall. And collectively, we are not in the corner in a fetal position with an abacus, right? We've got, our industry partners who are thinking deliberately about and really creatively about, the threats that are out there. And I think that really is our asymmetric advantage and our superpower.
Brett.
Yeah, the FBI has invested a tremendous amount of resources in our public-private sector partners, anything from our Domestic Security Alliance to our InfraGard program. In Cyber Division specifically, we have the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance up in Pittsburgh. We have TACU, which is a unit down in Huntsville that does DIB, or Defense Industrial Base-based engagement on the cyber threat. And we do that because private sector runs platforms, they run services, they run endpoint detection capabilities that have visibility in the whole that is tremendously greater than what the US government has. Meaning, there are certain companies who can see macro shifts in TTPs before we see it. And when you have foreign nation states shifting TTPs in ways that are meaningful to private sector companies or critical infrastructure, meaning they may have significant impact, and those companies can provide us without impeding on the privacy concerns of their downstream customers. When they can provide us shifts in those TTPs, the US government, through our law enforcement and intelligence community authorities, have tremendous micro level capability to collect. And so we have to leverage that when we engage private sector and we see those shifts. If a nation state is doing something, if a criminal adversary is doing something, we can do court authorized techniques that can allow us to better identify who those actors are, what they're doing, and to disrupt them. And so we don't see those shifts unless private sector engages us early. So there are companies that see that, and we hope will share with the intelligence community what those shifts are. But as victims of cybercrime too, when somebody is victimized by an actor, it may be the first time that they have seen the actor on their network, but it's probably not the first time we've seen them. So we bring value back to those partnerships, either through our international partners. If this is the first time an exploitation has happened to a US-based company, the Dutch, the Australians, the Brits, anybody else may have seen those actors, and we can bring IOCs or threat intelligence to bear that can help organizations identify, detect, contain, and remediate those actors from their environment. So bringing the law enforcement community in can also have that reciprocal benefit, that reciprocal value of helping you with your remediation process by providing that intelligence not available to any private sector company.
Yeah, and just a quick commercial on that. So I have, in incident response mode, on behalf of companies, actually done this anonymously. So stripped out the customer identifiers because legal counsel didn't, they said, sure, we can engage the FBI, but we don't want anybody to know who we are. And so we actually can do that anonymously and actually get that intel back to the customer about this is probably how that actor is going to behave on your network. Look for these files, look for these things. And the FBI still doesn't know who those victims were. And so it really is a great partnership. And just full disclosure, I was a co-VP of InfraGard in North Carolina. So I've got a bias there. But I want to tell you the system really works, and it really does work on your behalf. MJ, anything that you want to add on that topic?
Yeah, I think, of course, we had to learn to listen to the private sector, and it's new to us. So, but in cybercrime, we learned really fast that it's really beneficial for everybody to work together. And in our office, we have the Electronic Crimes Task Force, where the major banks and credit card companies in the Netherlands come together one day a week. And there we share the newest information about the phishing panels or new Trojans that are being used in banking fraud. And with sharing that information, they can file a report right away, and we can start an investigation or give information to other international partners so they can start an investigation. And I think these are examples that, that's really beneficial for everybody to work together. And a funny fact, I mentioned the project Melissa. The first time that we came together with the cybersecurity companies, we noticed that if they were in the negotiation phase, the woman who picked up the phone was called Melissa, and she did do this for several ransomware cases. But we would never have known that if we didn't talk to each other. So sometimes, even with little things, we learn new things. So that's really great.
And I guess I would just take the opportunity to double down on some of Brett's commentary around the unique visibility that industry can provide. And the second part is the scale that industry provides. So, when we are talking about genuinely trying to shape and impose cost on the tradecraft and TTPs of our adversaries, it is industry who can actually achieve that scale and actually turn the needle on that front. The unique visibility piece, so I mentioned our first use of cyber sanctions earlier this year. So, working alongside industry, we were able to identify a Russian cybercriminal, Alexander Ermakov, who was behind the Medibank hack in Australia and the release of a significant amount of Australian personal information. So we were able to, again, using government's visibility, but also industry's visibility, get that to a real-world identity to the point that we could actually sanction that individual. And open source reporting indicates that Russian law enforcement have actually arrested this individual, and we've got sort of real-world consequences and real-world cost imposed there. And it also demonstrates to the public that there are, consequences, and that we can work together in partnership with industry to actually sort of demonstrate outcomes and those consequences that happen when people target Australia, for example. So
Yeah, can I just double down on that real quick? And one of the things I mentioned earlier was the Hafnium hack, which is a zero-day exploit of the cloud vulnerability. But the work that we did with, across the interagency with the commercial sector partners there was really, how did the partner use its apertures to be able to, fix those vulnerabilities, and it defended. It mitigated the vulnerabilities for hundreds of thousands of people, not only in the United States, but also globally, right? And so there's certainly law enforcement action, but there's a defensive component of what industry can provide because of the apertures that they have. And so we don't have the market cornered on intelligence. And so again, just the ability of some of these defense industrial base companies or commercial partners are just incredible.
I'm so glad that you brought up Hafnium, because I think it is important to talk about the private sector's role in helping disrupt that. Does anybody else have anything you feel comfortable sharing about the private sector's role in disrupting that? So thanks, Lorna, for taking us there, because we needed to go there next.
Yeah, so I think Hafnium, for those who were not tracking, was a unique exploit of Microsoft Exchange on-premises servers, vulnerable servers. This was work by PRC-based actors to drop web shells in those environments, which would provide access later. So Microsoft and others had identified this vulnerability within those Exchange servers. Ultimately, they were working to patch and remediate that. Unfortunately, not all customers were looking to patch and remediate that. And so you have to apply patches to fix what vulnerabilities. And when you don't do that, the actors want to drop opportunities to persist in those environments. And that's what they did with these web shells. And so, private sector identifies that. They roll out and they develop patches to fix that vulnerability. They try to engage customers who are not engaged in, patching that environment in order to help them understand the threat environment. And then, and they did a tremendous job. Microsoft and others went out and they worked with customers to really understand what that exposure was and to fix that exposure. But there are a there were in this case hundreds of individuals who remained vulnerable. And what that means is not just now that the vulnerability was disclosed, the race was on, right? It's not just the Chinese actors who want to get into your environment. It's ransomware actors, it's other nation states. Anybody can exploit that web shell, get in and do really bad things against you or other organizations using your infrastructure. So private sector, identified and fixed to the extent they could what that was. And then it became a situation where law enforcement had to act, and our DoD partners had to act, because this is a global vulnerability. This is not just a US-based exploitation. To close down access to any malicious actor to get on those devices and either target critical infrastructure, government agencies, or the endpoint users themselves. And so we use what we call Rule 41. That is an opportunity for us to do court-authorized action, meaning our agents have to go before a U.S. district court. They have to assert in an affidavit that there is evidence or instrumentalities of criminal conduct held on these devices, and we are going to search and seize seize that code itself for law enforcement purposes, which does two things. It denies the adversary use of that infrastructure, and it also protects the end victim from re-victimization from the actor. And so that's what we did with Hafnium. That was one of our first Rule 41 operations, where we used our law enforcement authorities to remove hundreds of vulnerabilities that could be used to target any of your organizations out there with that infrastructure and to protect those end victims. And we worked with our partners at Cyber Command to really have that global impact on the actors as opposed to just localizing that to the United States.
And so it just kind of underscores again how we work by, with, and through each other, right? Like this is team sport, as I've heard from my former boss, Rob Joyce. And so how do we build a team so we can move fast? I think it's all about what we see these actors doing is trying to erode the trusts that we've built. And so, we've heard about Volt Typhoon. What is that intended to do? It's to create, distrust in our critical infrastructure and our government's ability to provide us services. And it's also to, have there's a psychological component to this. And as we work against malicious cyber actors, we're also looking at, they're learning from us. And we're a learning organism that we found where we've had to maneuver a lot to be able to impose cost, but at the end of the day, operate within our democratic values and norms.
And just briefly, I think this also continues to underline the fact that industry were the first to identify this vulnerability. They're the first that, in a lot of cases, to identify new tradecraft, new TTPs, new vulnerabilities, and that they were the solution to scaling out to fix it through patching. I think the other part of the partnership piece to this was Microsoft were great. They were out there getting the patch and getting it out there, but we collectively, as governments and as national cybersecurity centers, came out and pushed out alerts and called out the malicious cyber activity to continue to raise the bar on an understanding and the urgency that was required to get that patching to occur. So I think, again, that just speaks volumes to the partnership programs we all have in our countries and that global approach to how we mitigate.
But it also speaks to the importance of transparency, right?
Yeah.
Like, you shine a light on some of these things and then, it goes away, maybe goes somewhere else. And that's why we campaign to be able to figure out, where these actors going to go next. But, these malicious cyber actors and these nation state actors, they really do not like the light. And so that's what we intend to do.
And to that end, if you are looking for a way to pull cyber threat intelligence, meaningful cyber threat intelligence, into your SOCs, into your corporate, your cyber centers, CISA Alerts is where the U.S. government now goes. NSA, Cyber Command, FBI, all the assets that the United States government has in the cyber threat intel space, we provide those through that one portal. And so Hafnium is where we did the joint cybersecurity advisory related to that, and that should be a key part of what you do for threat intelligence, because we put that out in a way that allows you to ingest it through, the MITRE we use MITRE framework, we use industry standards to get that information out that helps you map it to TTPs. So would encourage everybody to take a look at CISA alerts.
MJ, anything?
No, I
Anything
think
to
a
add?
lot has been said about it, and also in the Netherlands we saw that the Digital Trust Center and the National Cybersecurity Center send out the messages about this, and it's really helpful, of course, with the sharing and the lines and the partnership. Yeah.
So MJ, since you went last, I'll give you the question first. You talk a little bit about the ways that your organization is making it harder for adversaries to attack critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it's the collaboration that we do have. So, for example, two big collaborations that we do have is the International Cybercrime Operational Group. It's the Five Eyes, together with France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and Europol. And in Europol we have the JCAT, it's the Joint Cyber Action Task Force, that are 13 EU member states and 7 EU partners. And together we work on cases, so we do proposals for new investigations. And I think one of the examples is the Lockbit case. That was Operation Kronos, led by the NCA and FBI and Europol. And actually this morning the identity was released, so that is I think a very good example on how we work together and do this kind of thing. So yeah, I think the most important thing is that we all have legal options in our toolbox, and if we combine them together, then we are able to fight cybercrime. So I think that's the most important for us now.
Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to close this with a question for each of the panelists. And Lorna, if you don't mind, I'll start with you first. And so, you know, I think what people will take away from this week is hope and optimism. At least I hope so. But it can be daunting when we're speaking about and looking at the volume and tempo of cyber attacks. So as we're concluding the panel, I want to leave people with sort of your final thoughts on what's keeping you in the fight. And what do you need from the private sector?
So from our perspective, a couple things. One, just know you've got some of the best men and women, both in the military, the intelligence community, and the folks that support the Cyber National Mission Force on this mission, right? And they show up to work every day. As a matter of fact, had a young offensive cyber operator that was talking to a group of folks, and he was, you know, trying to convince, you know, talk to them about the work that he does. And he goes, look, I get to do this, show up to work every day and do this for my nation. If I were doing this in the basement, my colleague from the FBI would arrest me. So, so that's the kind of folks that you have, right? And I think across our collective organizations, you have people that show up to work every day with a passion for the mission, and that they, you know, they get the remit and they get the threat to our nation. And so they think it's a just cause and they're getting after it. So that's the first thing. It's just the quality of the people that we have. We are made better by the partnerships that we have with industry. And what I mean, and like I said, on my joint task force, I have industry members that are working with us every day to help us to be able to, one, persist against the adversary, but also give us options to be able to impose costs. And so that's really a serious remit for us. At the end of the day, though, we really, really do need the brightest that we have in industry that are unconstrained by, you know, our governmental constructs, to be able to give us the, you know, different ways of thinking about how we would get after some of these threats. But the other piece of this is just know that, you know, we've been collectively experienced, you know, at least from Lorna Malek's perspective, lots of deployments globally in combat. And, you know, this is one of the best experiments that I've seen out there, not being born and raised in the United States. And it's worth fighting for, much like my colleagues will fight for their democracies. And so it's, you know, the people in industry who have the best ideas that are going to bring that to us. And again, I'll say that again. You know, our citizens, they're our superpower. And I think that's the thing that I'm heartened about, that, you know, we all have battle space. And once we take a problem on, we'll get after it.
James?
Yeah, you're right, Teresa. It can be a bit daunting sometimes. I think we're going to have job security for the foreseeable future in cybersecurity, but sort of what keeps me in the fight, and I guess why we're here today, and why I continue to sort of show up to work, is the partnerships piece. That's part of the reason I'm on this panel and honoured to be up here with everyone. It's part of the reason to make the journey from Australia all the way over to the US to meet with everyone. But realistically, that is how we get after this. That is how we have the scale and the sophistication and the ability to sort of combat that evolving threat. The key point I would probably underline is that we need to have those relationships and partnerships in place before crisis. So it's a much more difficult conversation if ASD's ringing you up and saying, hey, we've got indicators that your network might be being targeted, you might have a ransomware event in the very near future. If the relationship doesn't exist, then that is a much more challenging conversation than if we have these relationships, these strategic partnerships in place already. The other point I would make is that we've spoken a lot about how we're imposing cost on the adversaries. The other side of the equation is a lot of the work that we're doing to harden our critical infrastructure and our networks of significance in Australia, and that again is through strategic partnerships with other cybersecurity providers or the network owners themselves. So that is the other half of the equation that we continue to focus in on. And so I think the final point I would make as well is that this is, if you're having your worst day, your network has just been ransomwared, you've just found a nation state actor on your network, pick up the phone, use these partnerships, talk to us, because you might be able to save 10 other CISOs from having a similarly bad day. This partnership here is global. If you are the first person in the world to detect this, or it's the first time you think it's been detected, pick up that phone in a timely fashion, have a chat to us, and we can throw the global apparatus and partnerships of the globe at the problem to help you with your recovery and response, and ideally have that sort of safe culture of protecting others while you're still having a rough day.
MJ.
Yeah, I think for a police force, the most satisfying, of course, is if we can make arrests and come to the point of the takedowns, of course. But if that's not possible, also we look at options like prevention and other things that we can do, and working together. And I think everybody also here has some piece of information, and if we can bring it together, then we are really powerful all together. And it makes for us seeking a lot easier, and I think hiding a lot harder. So I think that's why we're here for.
Fantastic. Now, before we bring it to a close, just a couple of housekeeping items. There is another group that will be coming in here, and my esteemed colleagues do have places they need to be, so please be respectful. They've got people here making sure they get to their next thing on time. So just from a housekeeping perspective, keep in mind they're going to ask us to leave the room and let my colleagues, kind of get out in the hallway and get along their way. Our time together went by so fast. Lorna, I think I would close it off with, you said something I think really, there were so many great pieces of advice and examples shared today, and I hope people took away something that you can take back to your enterprise. But you said something that I want to close with, which is, the adversary isn't 10 feet tall. And you're right, that the level of collaboration and camaraderie that we have on the good guy and the good gal side outmatches anything on the cyber criminal and the nation state element side. And that is going to be the key to winning. We may have battles we lose here and there, but it's going to be key to winning over and over again. So thank you all so much for what you do every single day and for what your teams do. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.